how much of history and prehistory is simply projection? We often cite ancient authors as factual observers, but they would have had their own biases and errors. Likewise, we tend to anthropomorphize critters' behavior and desires. I think those are two, I see that they're related, but I think there's really two different questions here.
There's three.
Okay, what are the three?
Well, the reason that we distinguish history from prehistory, and the distinction is prehistory is that which is before the invention of writing for the culture in question. So the idea is a first-person account of something is not objective because people are not objective, but a first-person account is different from something that we reconstruct in the aftermath. And then there's the question of the anthropomorphizing of creatures. And I would argue there's sort of a spectrum here, right? A person was there, they observed, but what we got was handed down through some non-written tradition. That involves a lot of transmutation of whatever actually happened to whatever we recovered.
But we are inferring through indirect means, like through potsherds or whatever. And we don't have to go through their understanding of what they were doing,
right?
Which is its own kind of bias that is introduced.
Well,
so the archaeological record, the prehistorical record, which is not a perfect overlap, but at least largely overlapping, does not have the problem of the people who you are trying to understand having had the capacity to lie to themselves or you in the interim between them communicating something and you receiving that communication.
Yeah, and in fact, at the risk of alienating a certain number of folks, the story of the virgin birth of Jesus shows us that even in a culture that had writing, it's not like you're getting an objective report, because what we now understand is that the word virgin is actually a mistranslation of the word young woman, and that, the virgin birth is a mythologizing of an event that, didn't happen that way. It can't biologically have happened that way, even if you think there's a tremendous amount of room inside of biology. We're talking about a male child of a female, so biologically,
even if the thing that has never been known to happen in humans, which is parthenogenetic birth, could not have a female producing a male.
Right, would not have had a female producing a male, and likewise, the rising from the dead. There's a whole lot in that story that does not describe a physical universe that we understand, and yes, you can impose a deity on it and all, but basically the point is, look, you had a culture that had writing. What we got is a fantastic story that does not match our understanding of the possible. Okay, that certainly suggests that what happened wasn't literal, right? But it becomes in many ways even worse if you have a culture where you are inferring from potsherds rather than even words.
Well, no, but I think I had the opposite interpretation.
Right, it takes a subjectivity out of it.
It takes a subjectivity out of it, and I'm reminded of the joke that I used to give to my animal behavior students, because animal behavior was one of the things that I loved teaching the most, and taught and provided the students both the education and the space in the curriculum to do complete pieces of research, from the idea to the hypothesis to the everything all the way to the end, the communicating the results in both writing and in a talk. And as we also did a lot of reading on human evolution and society and behavior, and I would say to the students, well, unfortunately, with whatever animals you're going to be studying for your research projects, you can't just ask them. We can't just interview them like anthropologists can. And the flip side of that is, and therefore what you see them doing is what they're actually doing. Now, it is your job to interpret what it means. And one of the important and non-intuitive skills in animal behavior specifically is, as you are doing, for instance, a focal watch, where you are watching one particular individual at a time, for an individual organism at a time, you write down, depending on your particular recording method, you write down exactly what you see them doing, not what you think it means. So, you write down the actual interactions between two, say, male Mandela frogs. You don't just write down fight. Now, you might start encoding it after you've seen it a number of times, like, this is a fight, but here's what I've actually written down. Because if you just write down what you think it is, then you go back later and you say, oh, well, I got 8 of these things. Really? How do you know? Well, because I said it was a thing and I've got 8 of them. Like, on what basis did you make that claim? I didn't record that. I just wrote down what I thought at the time, which was that it was a fight. And then you have no data and you have no basis on which to make any claim at all that what you were actually seeing was a fight or territorial or anything. This is made both easier and harder by talking to humans about what it is that they think they're doing, because they will not only deceive themselves, they will also deceive others. They may deceive you, the ethnographer, as the informant from a population that is being investigated by, what might appear to be like random white people who've shown up and want to know things about them. So that, there's pros and cons in each of these situations. And yes, there's going to be bias, but I think it's actually going to be, it's one reason that seeking data from, when you're talking about humans, seeking both direct and indirect evidence will help you map the things onto one another and see if they actually match up.
Yeah. I must say, there is a kind of care that has to be taken when understanding animals, but I often see people draw the line someplace that I believe makes no sense, right?
Yes.
In other words, to the extent that you are looking at a mammal, you are looking at a creature where there is a justification for a certain amount of extrapolation. And if you're looking at a primate, it is even more the case. And this is proven by Jane Goodall, who cracked the case with respect to chimpanzees by virtue of the fact that she did anthropomorphize them, and that basically you couldn't make progress if you treated them as objects. And that and that frankly, it's not subtle. When a chimpanzee is angry at another chimpanzee, it's obvious. And you are, there is a limit to what you can understand about why it's angry. But deciding that you don't even know that it's angry is obviously absurd, right? Likewise, I think I was describing on a recent podcast that a cat may actually like to have its tail pulled. If you lift up a cat by its tail, not a cat that's overweight, if you take a cat and you gently lift up its hindquarters by its tail, you can tell that it actually likes it. I'm not saying every cat does, but many cats do, and you can tell because when you put them back down, they circle back to have you do it again. And the point is, there aren't a lot of interpretations there. The animal has returned to the place that something happened, right? Not because it doesn't want that thing to happen. So anyway, there's a lot that one can infer.
Yeah, and it should be a cat who knows you and who likes you and knows that you know and like them as well. I totally agree with you about anthropomorphism, and that was what I saw as the second part of this question originally. And I think it's Franz de Waal who has said in several of his books, basically, what the hell is wrong with people who claim that you can't anthropomorphize animals? You have to if what you're trying to do is understand their behavior and their social systems. Because pretending that we aren't humans doing the interpretation, and pretending that we don't share much of what they are with them, is the kind of, it's frankly a religious style mistake. Imagine that there's this discrete boundary between what humans do and what everyone else does, is to forget that what you're looking at is an evolutionary process.
Yep. In fact, I'll just add one more thing, which is that there is a very famous philosophical piece. I can't believe I'm not remembering the exact title, something like What It's Like to Be a Bat by Nagel.
Yeah.
And a teaching partner actually inflicted this, what I believe is a terrible, What It's Like to Be a Bat.
What is it like to be a bat? From 1974.
Inflicted this on a class that we were co-teaching. And, there is an element of warranted caution in here. But basically, Nagel's point is, you'll never know. And having studied bats, I can tell you it's not that dire. There's lots you will never know about being a bat. But there's also lots of stuff that you can infer rather easily. And, I'm not arguing it's not an art figuring out where to draw that line so that you don't over-extrapolate. But hobbling yourself by saying, a bat is a very different creature, and therefore you couldn't possibly know anything, is absurd. And the fact is, at least in the realm of animal behavior, we learn from those who do the job well, not those who champion the fact that no one can do the job well.
That's absolutely right. And we acknowledge that it will be more difficult to do the inference that we are trying to do with regard to animal behavior, the more distantly related the organism is.
Yep.
So it's harder. It's harder to know the mind of a frog than the mind of a bat. Harder yet to know the mind of a shark. A coral's really going to be tough, in part because they don't have a mind. But
Right.
What is it like to be a morel? What is it like to be?
Well, what is it like to be a morel? Probably nothing.
So I mean, then the question presumes you are suggesting that there's a self-reflection, that there's a consciousness possible, in which case for some of these organisms the question doesn't make sense even before you get to morel.
Right.
That probably doesn't, it doesn't make sense for a coral either.
Right. Well, here's the tough one, is something like a spider or an insect. If you see an insect behaving, if an insect is trapped in a jar and it behaves in the way an animal in the zoo does, and it runs some circuit and it apparently has lost its mind, it isn't clear that the animal has a subjective experience. You can't rule it out, but it's really hard to understand what would be enhanced about the functioning of the creature if it did have a subjective experience. So it's quite possible.
Even under purely normal functional circumstances.
Right.
Yeah.
So the problem is that if a mongoose in a cage and an insect in a similar environment behave in the same panicked or stereotypical way, you can be pretty darn sure that the mongoose has a subjective experience not terribly different from yours. It is very hard to make a powerful argument that the insect has one. You can't rule it out, but the point is there's a reason that an animal that didn't have a subjective experience would behave just like one that did, and that's because the subjective experience is trying to solve the same unsolvable puzzle as the automatic experience. And so what I would argue is, you have a subjective experience. You're on pretty solid ground to infer that the mongoose does. And when you get to the insect, if you don't recognize that you've got a difficult puzzle, that at least leaves open the possibility that the animal has no subjective experience, but it is of course possible that it does for reasons you haven't figured out yet. That's kind of where the gray area is. And I really do look at insects this way, and spiders. I look at them and I think, I can't rule it out, but I can't understand why it would be there. And so I have to be agnostic, really, right? I have to say, I personally doubt it, but if you came up with evidence that said, oh, it does have a subjective experience, I'd say, oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah. No, and there's, it's interesting then. Part of what we have done sort of professionally is try to understand why the subjective experience in the terminology you're using now, some with great overlap with theory of mind, right? Great overlap with consciousness, why it shows up where it does. So when you say insects and spiders, at first I think, okay, it's going to be all invertebrates, except for cephalopods.
Right. What do you do?
Right. So what are you going to do with cephalopods? What are you going to do with octopus and some squid at least, maybe? And then, is it all vertebrates? No, it's not all vertebrates. It's not going to be, I don't know, sardines.
Right. Well, could be.
Schooling.
You're in sort of a similar position as insects. It's hard to see where a sardine gets a value from a subjective experience, and if it doesn't get a value, then there won't be one. But what do you do with a Sicilian? Right.
I didn't know you were anti-Italian.
No, different spelling, right? Yeah, okay.
So different. So different.
I'm proud to know just that it is spelled differently, having no real idea how to spell either one of them.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna blow people's minds who give any kind of a crap at all about spelling. The Sicilian to which you were referring is Caecilian, and it's one of the three clades of amphibians that no one's ever heard of. So you got frogs, which includes toads, you got salamanders, which includes newts, and then you got Sicilians, which are entirely pantropical except for Madagascar, burrowing, legless amphibians. So what are you going to do with Sicilians?
Yeah, it's hard to see where a subjective...
And pretty solitary. I think they have maternal care. They have good maternal care, but then they go do their Sicilian thing, burrowing and spending all their life underground.
They do. The Godfather theme is now playing in my mind as a result of your terrible accusation of me. But But anyway, so this is the real question: is you won't see subjective experience is expensive to produce, so you won't see it where at least the ancestor of the creature hasn't gotten a benefit for it. But it's not the only way to get to rational puzzle solving. So.